Elaine Kub is our market analyst this week. The U.S. Department of Agriculture reports that 81% of the nation's corn crop has been planted, and 50% of the crop has emerged. Meanwhile, the nation's soybean crop is 56% planted, with 26% overall emerged. Corn prices showed highs in both July and December futures this week, while soybean prices continue to be bullish. There is still no guarantee that trade tensions are over between China and the U.S. However, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, China has agreed to increase purchases of U.S. farm and energy products. In the near future, Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross will be traveling to Beijing to further discuss trade. We talked with Elaine Wednesday morning about these uncertain trade issues, but began by asking her about the recent USDA crop progress report.
Yeah, nationwide they said 81% in the Monday report, so by now it's effectively virtually complete. And there certainly are some isolated areas where they did have very wet weather this spring, where there was frustration, certainly in that Wisconsin, Michigan tier areas of northwest Iowa and southeast South Dakota were also fairly late, and there's some frustration there. But given the overall forecast, the weather forecast, generally speaking, or nationwide speaking, there's not going to be a major late planting concern. It was a tighter window this year, certainly because the beginning of everything was late because of how cold the spring was. But generally speaking, the seed will be in the ground. The grain will get started here with fairly favorable weather conditions.
Yeah, because according to the report, we're about 20% almost done with corn. But then up north, where you are in South Dakota, you guys are about 20% behind Nebraska.
Yeah, so there was, like I mentioned, some wet weathers in some spots in eastern South Dakota. But rain makes grain, right? Just because it was late or because there was frustration getting it in at a certain time doesn't mean it won't get in and doesn't mean it won't grow. So you worry about that. And then the bigger worry, I think, from that eastern South Dakota area where there was the late planting or somewhat late planting, is the spring wheat. So you see the spring wheat planting numbers are really quite far behind their 5-year averages, and that spills over into Minnesota also. And that to me suggests that there's going to be some spring wheat fields that just won't be planted. And that was something that was always going to be the concern when we had that very cold spring and very late start to planting. And I think that's playing out, and we're just kind of seeing it in those crop progress numbers, and it won't officially show up in any sort of supply and demand table until it ends up as an acreage number.
Along with spring wheat, there's also the soybeans. There's been a lot of talk about soybeans with China. There's still no guarantee that trade discussions are going to be finalized with the U.S. and China. Tell me a little bit more about how that's going to affect the market.
Bridget, you are so right to point out there is no guarantee, right? From one day to the next, we really don't know what the final outcome will be of all of these rumors. But as we are taping this right now, the inclination is, or the thought is, that the two countries are going to work things out and not initiate these tariffs, this 25% tariff against U.S. soybeans going into China. China has declared that it is not in the public's best interest to have these feed grains or the soybeans have higher prices. So that is very optimistic to me, and we see that in the futures markets. We see the November soybean price coming back towards that 1060 level where it was right before the day before all of this tariff talk got started. So to see that equilibrium be reestablished, that's very hopeful. And if the hopefulness of these tariff talks can get finalized, then I think the soybean market will really have a chance to reflect perhaps longer term demand growth.
And with the soybean market, do you think Brazil and Argentina are going to affect that as well?
I think absolutely. I mean, they always do. But at this point, we don't have a big story coming out of Brazil or Argentina from the soybean side. We're still a little bit focused on the Brazilian second crop of corn. There is still some potential for some bullishness there. They have had a dry spell here these past couple of months, but in the near-term forecast, there's just enough rain to keep the market from really exploding there. But that's really the story coming out of South America at the moment.
Yeah, going on with corn hasn't really changed much since like the first week of May, right?
Yeah, it's a much quieter market than soybeans, that's for sure. But I will point out that the last time I looked at my screen, December corn was at $4.25, so it reached sort of a new high here, and that's a pretty favorable price. That's certainly something that folks should be keeping their eye on.
What do you expect with corn throughout the summer? How do you think weather is going to influence?
This is the time of the year when I know farmers and marketing decisions is probably not the top thing on their mind. Getting things planted and getting weeds sprayed is probably the top things on their mind. but this is absolutely the time of the year when we shouldn't be putting things off or shouldn't be ignoring it. There are some times of the year where you always kind of know, well, probably nothing's going to happen. We're probably not going to reach our seasonal highs. But this is the time of the year. May, June, July, you've really got to have a plan in place or an expectation to get some things sold, because when we are faced with what we have here in 2018, broadly favorable planting, broadly favorable long-term forecasts, probably a reduction in the drought scenario or the dryness scenario in southern Iowa. All of that has to point to an expectation that we will have a very large crop and therefore lower prices at harvest. So absolutely, I think folks should be looking for seasonal highs here in the next 6 weeks.
Along with corn, wheat has been experiencing a lot of weather impacts. Spring wheat is actually almost planted, like you mentioned in the crop progress report update. But tell me a little bit more about how wheat is being affected.
Yeah, wheat has seen some higher prices here. That KC wheat contract reflecting the still dry weather for the southern plains. In Kansas, obviously, still has a lot of drought, Oklahoma as well. So that is somewhat reflected in those futures prices, but there's another scenario where the sort of short-term forecast or the 7 to 10-day forecast gives just enough weather, just enough precipitation for certain areas to keep the market from exploding. So I'm more interested in seeing the spring wheat prices, reestablish the premium that they historically hold over the winter wheat prices, which we have not seen. I don't feel that concern that I have about spring wheat acreage is fully priced into that market yet.